All right, my friends, we are back on Barriers and Boundaries Resilience Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, EB, and I got to tell you, I'm super excited for my guest today, good buddy of mine, Steve Labue. How are you doing, Steve?
Ready to rock and roll.
Just a great conversation I know we've had over the years, known each other for a long time. And on the podcast, love to talk about resilience in both organizational and personal, but I often split those up. So sometimes I'll focus on personal, sometimes I'll focus on organizational. Not a lot of opportunity to where there's a topic that comes along where it strongly applies to both aspects of resilience. And we've heard a lot about emotional intelligence. We heard a lot about IQ. Those are very important intelligence aspects to be mindful of, but there's one that I wanted to bring you in on because you have a great insight into this and something definitely worth hearing about. And that is contextual awareness. So where do we start? We start with the organizational side of things. You want to go into the personal side of things?
Contextual awareness. I mean, when you approached me, first of all, I think I was supposed to be like your first guest on this podcast. And now you're so many episodes in and I'm just now making it here to the show. So I appreciate being here and thanks for the invite. And it's always good to converse with you, my friend. So thanks.
Yeah. Well, I do want to do like, who are you? But I got a feeling that's going to come out towards the end of our conversation.
Oh yeah, we'll get that. I can't not talk about myself at some point. So we'll definitely get into that, but probably not in a way that the audience might be expecting. So we'll see what happens. But when you first asked me to talk about contextual awareness, like, you might as well have asked me to come on and just talk about the universe because context, as you know, for me, matters a lot. In the world of StrengthsFinder, context is my number one. And, when I work with folks on StrengthsFinder, I often talk about how these aren't necessarily themes of strength or talent, but they're really about propensity for awareness. So that whatever theme you have a natural awareness to those themes. And so for me, that's definitely applicable for context. I think that I'm always thinking about context. I'm always evaluating contexts. So when you asked me, I was kind of paralyzed for a minute because I'm just like, this is my whole world. Where do I even begin to talk about, my world? And yeah, at some point we'll talk about me. But I think with any conversation, I think it helps to kind of define your terms because when you and I talk about contextual awareness, because of our relationship, we know what each other means when we use those words. Or when we say emotional intelligence, we understand we're using that word in the same way. Other people have a completely different version or definition. And so I think that it's helpful for us to kind of define the terms so that as we talk about this, people understand how we're talking about it.
That's a great place to start. How do you define the terms that we use?
Yeah. And I think using that same language, right? Contextual awareness is really understanding what room you're in. And then emotional intelligence is knowing how to respond to that room, right? Like you could be the best omelet maker in the world, but if you're standing in the living room, you're probably going to end up making a big mess or it's not going to get you very far. So it's knowing what room am I in. In Southeast Asia, they use the term like reading the air for kind of the emotional intelligence piece. But it's also about taking in not just like, oh, I'm in the conference room or I'm in my boss's office or I'm in my living room. It's really about not just saying I'm in my living room, I'm in my boss's office, I'm in the conference room. It's really about understanding all the energies that are present in the room as well. Is it negative? Is it positive? Is it both and? Is there a lot of mixed emotions going on? So having that awareness of what your context is, what the setting is, that then determines and dictates what response is best needed for that particular situation. So you can have contextual awareness without emotional intelligence, but you cannot have emotional intelligence without contextual awareness.
So let's say you have a few people that show up to a meeting. Like what kinds of energies, examples come to mind?
Oh yeah. So let's say we sit down in a meeting and Tom just found out that his father has cancer and Emily just got engaged over the weekend. Rebecca had a big fight with her partner right before coming to work. And that new MBA grad that you just hired is, just happy to be there and hoping that they make a good impression and don't screw things up. You've got all sorts of things going on, and they bring all that to the table, and then you sit down with your own agenda. You've got a lot of different emotions. You have fear, you have excitement, you've got love, you've got disappointment, you've got anxiety, you've got hope. So there's a lot of things that people are bringing to the table besides just themselves or whatever their work product is.
And what would make that distinction between the emotional aspect of it versus that contextual? They're not just processing the fear, but they're also processing a relationship with somebody else outside of that room, or maybe even a future with that organization that they're a part of.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point of recognizing that people may not be fully present in the room because part of their mind is off somewhere else, thinking about how they're going to reconcile, how they might celebrate those conversations that they may need to have after the meeting. And I think for organizational leaders, I think this can become one of the barriers to effective leadership and organizational culture is having the mindset that contexts in the workplace are neutral, that this is just work and we all just come to work, we do our jobs and we go home. But the reality is that contexts are not neutral, that the workspaces are not neutral. And so when we walk into a space, either with other people or even if we just try to sit quietly with ourselves, there's often no neutrality. We can't just sit quietly in the moment without other factors coming into our mind, things telling us it's awfully quiet in here, or I can't sit still for too long, my knees hurt. All those things impact our ability to focus. So there is no neutrality. And so these aren't things, going back to our meeting example, those aren't things that we sort out before the meeting. But if we recognize that people with all of their ups and all of their downs make up the context of our organizational culture, then hopefully that awareness will encourage us to lead with a little more compassion and a little more curiosity, because that work that's done in the hallway or in the break room of just connecting with your people will go a long way in the boardroom and the conference room when people can feel heard, they feel safe to talk about those factors that they might be bringing into the workplace.
And you discussed making it more effective by removing barriers. And I know there's a story there where if you can just think in more of a general context, let's say you're an organizational leader, you have a meeting in mind that you want to focus on, an agenda or a theme, but being contextual is almost like connecting the dots to even a bigger impact. Can you share any thoughts about, hey, don't limit yourself by not thinking contextually?
One thing that comes to mind is, let's say you make an organizational decision, or there's a decision or a direction that the organization is going to take, and that impacts everybody. And so this announcement gets rolled out, and before you have a chance to collect feedback, you call another meeting and you bring all these people into the room to talk about a budget or some part of your operation. Right. Well, what's one of the contextual elements that's going to be present in that room? How people are responding to the big corporate decision that you just rolled out, right? Some people may be thinking like, am I even going to have a job in 6 months? Are people thinking like, well, who's going to be up for that promotion? Is it going to be me? How's this going to affect my working hours? Are we going to get bonuses? Am I going to have to work longer hours? Everyone's going to have a different opinion on that corporate response. And so jumping into a new meeting with a new agenda without potentially addressing some of that energy, I think could derail the whole purpose of the meeting before it even gets off the ground.
Yeah, I think there's a big risk there. And if you don't have somebody to kind of help process the impact, the risk of that decision or choice. I know we were a part of something, our organization that we were both a part of, wanting to focus on one thing, not seeing the impact it had on a much bigger perspective.
Yeah, and I've also seen leaders that make decisions and they only seem to be concerned about the perspective that employees had of them as a leader rather than about what was actually put out. So for them, their context was, this was all about me. And so I'm going to put this out to show off my own strength and my own talents. And when something challenges that or provides a different perspective that, well, there were other factors at play, they could take that as a threat response rather than an opportunity to kind of widen the aperture and gain greater clarity on their organization. Our organizational culture is made up of people that are broken. We're hurting people. We're broken. We make mistakes. We have ups and downs, and all of that milieu of energy makes up our organizational culture. And so yeah, I mean, you and I were a part of an organization where senior leadership was, having this massive conference about recruitment. And when asked about a session on retention, the response was simply, no, this is about recruiting. Completely unaware that there's a correlation between retention and recruitment. That if you take care of your people, if you pour into them and you make your culture a safe and energetic and positive space to work in, recruitment will probably naturally take care of itself because they're going to talk about how great it is to work there. They're going to do their own recruiting, and your recruitment budget will probably be a lot smaller than it would have to be. And if you don't take care of your people, if you don't focus on retention, then that leads to turnover, which is often one of the biggest expenses that ends up hitting your HR budget. And not to mention, it slows down your operational efficiency. Now all of a sudden you have to worry about gaps and just finding the right people, where if you just took care of the people that you had, you'd be a lot better off.
I love that ability to, it's really just thinking through things. When you're really trying to focus on contextual awareness, contextual development, it's really kind of thinking through all these different aspects of our approach, our responses, our engagements. That's a lot. So yeah, when you say, let's talk about the universe, contextual awareness is one of those big conversations to have. Where do you start with a leader when you say, hey, I would love to consult, or I would love to discuss your ability to think contextually? Where do you start?
One of the questions that I often asked leaders was to just kind of tell me their own leadership story and highlight some of the things, like what were some of the key moments that impacted your leadership development. If a leader can articulate that, then it tells me that they understand their story, that they're already thinking contextually in some way, shape, or form. Being able to highlight specific moments having key impacts on their own story and who they are as a person and as a leader. That's the question that I often start with. And part of that is to get them to reflect on their story if they haven't yet, to think back and say, what were those things that really impacted me? And sometimes they're positive, they're great experiences that they have where, hey, I was a young leader and I had another leader come and mentor me and kind of show me the ropes and really provided a backstop for me so that I wouldn't fail in that new role. Other times it's negative, where they said, you know what, I worked for the absolute worst leader that I could have created in my own mind. And watching them make mistake after mistake after mistake, or lead so poorly, and seeing how that affected people, that also impacted my leadership to where I never wanted to put my people through that same type of experience. So they could be good and bad reflections.
Sure. That's a phenomenal place to start, just because it allows you to kind of see things from their perspective, because you're bringing your world into that meeting as well. One of the things that I have always appreciated in our conversations over the years, one of the things that you taught me a long time, probably 10 years ago, let's say you're a program manager, you're going into a meeting with your boss, asking what has been your experience with a program manager in the past, along those lines of, how have you dealt with people who are in my position? And that's just another, like, let's peek behind the curtain of who you are and your context, that allows, communication, engagements to be more authentic, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because if that person happened to be a project manager before or program manager before and then got promoted to where they're looking at you going like, I've done your job. I can probably do your job better than you, but now I have to let go and create space for you to do that job. And I think calling that out from the beginning, is, I think, is key to not only just effective communication, but also to set up partnership and collaboration. And hopefully that's what we're working towards. We're looking for opportunities to collaborate, not just with our peers and our subordinates, but also with our leaders. And that kind of comes up to, I think one of the other barriers that leaders often face is their blind spots. We have blind spots. I had a mentor that used to say, you can't see your own backside without help. So there's nothing else outside of you that you're going to be able to see 360. And so there's going to be things about ourselves that we don't know that we don't know. And even when we're absolutely certain about something or even someone, we should still take time to step back and ask our team, what else should we be thinking about regarding this? What are we not considering? Or even like, who's not in the room with us that needs to be in this room?
All right. So I want to double down on what you just said right there, because I have so many ideas of where that principle was not utilized. All right. So let's think about who's not in the room that should be. Let's think about what we don't know about the situation. When you talk about expanding your thoughts, your context, that's the connection piece right there. Those types of questions. So a lot of this is leading into asking good questions. How to know what questions to ask. Leaders need this ability to ask the right questions.
Yeah, but I think that's something that comes with time. So I would just encourage leaders, if you're not asking your people questions out of curiosity, then just start asking questions. And as you get used to that and you start having more of those kinds of dialogue, better questions will come. You'll realize it's kind of like, if you ever played the game 20 Questions, where you're trying to think of an object, and it's just, as you get through, all of a sudden the object in question becomes more clear. Not necessarily because you asked the right question, but because you asked enough questions. And I think that it all begins with curiosity. I think leaders should lead with curiosity, stepping into places where, even if they've been a CEO for 30 years, the chances are people have turned over underneath them. And so that means that their organizational culture has changed. And the culture inside an organization 30 years ago is very different than what it is today. So just to say, well, I've been doing this for 30 years, so there's nothing left for me to learn, that's a CEO I would be very afraid of, because they don't have a growth mindset. They're not acknowledging their blind spot. Curiosity requires us to ask questions of ourselves, of other people, of our situations. And often the biggest barrier to curiosity is our fear of what the answer might be. People don't like to ask questions when they're afraid to hear the answer.
Our biggest barrier to curiosity is being afraid of what the answer might be. So I got to let this stuff soak in, man. This is the conversation I've been wanting to have with you for so long. So there's a lot of emotional intelligence in that. There's a lot of this curiosity versus assumptions. I don't know if assumptions maybe that's the right word for like what's opposing curiosity, but I do believe that the fear is hidden beneath the surface of assumptions as well. It might come from this desire for a leader to project order or something.
Well, I think we have, one of the things that's prevalent is this idea of wisdom. People desire wisdom. There's a lot of sacred texts that talk about pursuing wisdom and pursue it at all costs. But, wisdom isn't always having the right answer. It's not always knowing what to say. And wisdom is knowing where to find the answer. And people who want to project themselves as being wise will often try to just communicate the answer. And there's a parable. I'll probably butcher it, but it's something like, even a fool is thought wise until he opens his mouth. So you can sit quietly in the corner and everyone thinking, well, he's probably the wisest person in the room. But as soon as he tries to project himself as being wise, we'll probably remove all doubt that he isn't. So, but it's if we recognize that wisdom is in knowing where to find the answer, then we have to hold on to the assumption that the answer that we're holding on to may not be the most correct one for that particular situation.
I've seen a lot of insecurity in leadership just simply by not wanting to engage in just that. And it makes me sad. It really does. It makes me sad. As much as it makes me frustrated, there's a lot of, it could be great opportunities. All that kind of stuff comes to mind. But I do want to touch on personal resilience as well. Any final thoughts on the organizational aspect of that? That was so good.
For now, I think that's, we might have to come back to it again, but I think that's the big takeaways that I would offer for folks right now is just recognizing that contexts aren't neutral and that everyone brings in different kinds of energy each and every day. And just if we're aware that that's happening, then we can respond to each day in the way that we're supposed to. And then the second piece is just being aware of our blind spots, that even when we think we know what we want, we're not often thinking that there could possibly be something better. I remember I was given a specific task and my boss came to me with this list of things that he wanted at our next meeting. And, I just started with the question of what are you really looking for? What are you really trying to solve with all this? And he told me and then said, now bring me X, Y, and Z. Well, at the meeting, I didn't bring him X, Y, and Z. I brought him A and B, we'll say. And he looked at me kind of like I was nuts and just said, what is this? I asked for all this other stuff. I said, yeah, but that's not what you actually need to solve the problem you're trying to solve. What you need is A and B, which is right here in front of you. And he took a step back and looked at it and he was like, you're exactly right. This is what I was looking for right here. But had I just brought him what he asked for without asking that question of what problem are you trying to solve or what are you trying to accomplish? Where are you trying to go? And kind of distill some of that down, he realized that what he really needed was something very different than what he asked for. I think it's recognizing that as one of the blind spots, that what we're asking for may not be what we need. And asking some of those questions can help us really distill things down to get to the point and become more efficient as an organization.
Yeah, there's another example of that question being used that I've used recently was on a job interview and wanting to really connect the dots between what the job description said and the company. One of my go-to questions is, what's the problem in this year that you're trying to solve that if I'm working in this position will help? And sometimes they don't have an answer to that. And I get it. Sometimes a job is just a job and it might be menial tasks that they may not see the connection piece, but it's almost like a curse in a good way of just thinking contextually. I'm looking at how does this apply to that? How does this apply to a bigger picture and wanting to be a problem solver? It's one of the soft skills that a lot of people look for on a resume, but actually don't know how to engage with it unless, you're talking about stuff like you just said. It's like, hey, I'm going to ask questions that are going to help us find out the information that we're really after in a given situation.
Yeah, I love that. And that reminds me of a story. There's I don't know if you call it a parable. I'll call it a parable. It's the parable of the three stonemasons. And there's a man who goes on a journey and he comes across a man cutting stone. And he asks the man, he says, hey, what are you doing here? And he just looks up at the guy and goes, I'm cutting stone. And then just goes right back to work. And the traveler moves on, comes across a second stone cutter and asks him, what are you doing here? And he says, I'm providing for my family here. And he thinks that's honorable. And so the traveler moves on and comes across a third stone cutter and asks him and says, excuse me, sir, but what are you doing here? And he says, I'm building a cathedral. And the reality is that we have all three of those people in our organizations. We have the people that just show up to just do what they're told. They just do the task, and that's kind of it. We have other people that are there for something perhaps just outside themselves. In this case, he's there for his work and he's there to provide for his family. And then you have somebody that actually has the vision of the organization and understands the role of his task in that vision. And for leaders, the question isn't about how do I continue to project my status, but how do I get people from cutting stone to building cathedrals and moving them down that continuum. And that's a constant cultivation of contextual and organizational awareness in your people. And that only comes through dialogue, not PowerPoints or training, but through one-on-one interpersonal relationships.
That gives a leader a great point of reference to engage with their staff as well. I would say you may not be all about, oh, let me talk to you about your family. What do you got going on in your personal life? But you can certainly talk to them about how connected they feel to the vision of the organization.
Or can they even explain it? Can they even articulate it?
Do they know what it is?
Yeah. And I think cultivating a bias towards action and a bias towards excellence. We can come to work and we just do the same task over and over and over again and never ask ourselves the question of, is there a better way to accomplish this task? Is there a way to cultivate excellence with what I'm doing rather than just, I'm just going to do this task because I'm not paid enough to think beyond this. And the reality is that people with that kind of thinking are never paid for their thinking. So it's like if they want to get paid, they got to start taking action. And you and I have seen so many times, certain processes that should not be as hard as people are making it to be. And especially when you have someone that has a bias to no rather than a bias to yes. And that kind of thinking just kills organizational workflow, organizational progress and processes, and it's just a cancer that hopefully will disappear someday in our workplaces.
It's good stuff, man. And I know there's going to be a lot of thoughts probably afterwards as well. Then I'm going to be like, hey, let's touch back on that.
Yeah,
that'll be fine. Personal resilience. Contextual awareness for the boundaries, the limiting narrative. Where do we start with discussing the personal aspect?
Well, I said at the beginning that context is kind of like my universe, and the reality is that I am the center of my universe. Everything that I experience has me at the center of that experience. And so I should probably just start with my story, or part of it anyway. Growing up, I think I had a pretty amazing childhood. I got to live by a lake. I had people that cared about me, but I also dealt with a lot of bullying, a lot of rejection, public school, private school, homeschool, back to public school. It was an identity rodeo of just, who am I? What am I doing here? Where am I going? Who am I becoming? And it was an identity that I think at the time, I thought I didn't have any control over that. I didn't have any control over who I was or who I was becoming. And I believed that lie. I believed the lie that I had no control over the truth of who I am and my story as it was unfolding. And so how this often played out is that I would dominate conversations, hoping that people would recognize my genius and provide me with validation and reveal the truth of who I was. And it's not hard to see the problem with that kind of thinking. And I think what I didn't know at the time was that when it came to writing my story, I was in control of the pen. And the problem was that I was giving that pen away to all these other people. I was giving them away to my circumstances, and I was letting those people or those circumstances write my story. And then I would end up unhappy with the story that got written. And so I think that one of the keys to being resilient is understanding that we maintain control of the pen and that we have the power to write our story and to tell our story. And while we can't always control what happens to us, we can always control how we respond. And so the question really becomes like, who or what is holding your pen? Are we giving away control of our story to others or to our circumstances?
Yeah, I want to double down on that, where you might not be able to control what happens to you, but you control your response. What does that look like practically when you say you're responding, you're in charge of your response to what happens to you?
Well, I think it comes back to some of the other things that we talked about with curiosity and compassion. And it requires a slowing down and reflecting internally about how does this make me feel? Why am I feeling this way? What are these emotions being triggered in me right now? And I can't remember where I read it, but it's a phrase that our emotions are our friends. Even like when we have these aggressive emotions, they're there to actually remind us or trigger something to get us to stop and reflect for a minute.
Yeah.
And so when we have something happen to us, maintaining control of the pen is first cultivating that awareness that the pen is even in your hand. I remember I came back from a long trip. I was away for a while, like a couple months. And I came back it was for work. And I met my wife at the airport. And she immediately took us to this party to help me reconnect with all my friends. And people were asking me, hey, how was your trip? And I really had no response because I hadn't been home but 45 minutes. Like I hadn't even had the time to consider what that trip meant to me, what my takeaways were, how I was different. The only thing that I knew was that my favorite Mexican restaurant that used to be outside the airport had closed and was now something else. And the music was all different on the radio. And there were just a lot of changes that I was becoming aware of. And I hadn't taken the time to consider the change that was happening or had happened in me during that time. And if we can identify who we are and what a situation means to us, again, that context has changed. When something happens to us, our context changes. When my father passed away, my context of having a dad I could always reach out to had changed. And so I had to kind of process what's this new context that I now find myself in, and how do I want to respond to that? And it comes back to this old adage of hurting people hurt people. And so if something changes in our lives that creates pain or anger or injustice, and we just immediately respond in kind with injustice, with anger, with fear, then we're probably not giving our best selves away to the situation. And we're probably not really going to find healing in those moments. And you and I have had these conversations about the difference between perfection and professionalism. That somebody who has a perfectionist mindset is this sense of, I have to project myself as having it all together all of the time. And when something happens and I become broken, or a part of me breaks off, I now have to figure out, like, what does this broken piece mean to me? Like, how do I relate to this hole that I have in my soul or in my heart and this piece that I'm now holding in my hand? And the perfectionist is going to try to fit it back together to say, no, I'm still perfect. I still have it all together. But someone that has more of the professional mindset is, and when I think about professionals, I think about people that are constantly learning and growing. They're constantly trying to improve and become better. And so someone with that mindset is going to say, okay, what can I learn from this? What does this hole in this piece have to teach me about who I am or who I need to be in this moment? And how can I grow from this experience? And those types of people will keep that piece in their hand, or they'll kind of put it in their pocket. And eventually they'll come across somebody that has a very similar story. And as that person shares their story about the hole that they have in their life, you begin to recognize like, hey, the hole that's in you actually looks a lot like the piece that I've been carrying around that broke off of me a long time ago. And then when we share our story and we find a purpose for that piece that broke off of us, that's when I think we both experience healing and transformation in ways that we didn't think possible. And in those moments now, that's controlling the pen. That's rewriting the story and giving greater purpose to our brokenness or to our pain, to our context. And this is something that we might give some purpose in the moment. And then as we continue to walk and journey with that throughout our lives, that purpose and that story grows richer. There's more details that get added over time. And at the end of the day, like, it just becomes beautiful.
The connection I make there is when you talk about purpose, I think it's dangerous to limit ourselves to one purpose. If someone goes to school, they get the job that they feel like is there, but then they retire. Okay, what do you do with that? So I think it's very dangerous to giving the pen to a purpose is dangerous in itself.
And I like to ask the question, how do I want to be known? And when I'm cheering my daughter at soccer practice, there's a sense of like, how do I want to be known in that context? I want to be the supportive dad. I want to be there for the whole team. I want to be encouraging. And there's a lot of other ways that I could show up and that I could develop a reputation for. I could be that dad that's just screaming at the referee because there's some imaginary scholarship on the line, or I'm thinking it's every game is the World Cup in high school soccer. So, and get myself thrown out.
I'll tell you this. I'll tell you, every time my son joins a new team and we set up the parent group chat, I always volunteer to be the one that yells at the refs. Just out the gate, just to get that out the way, just for fun. I let them know I'm going to judge them ahead of time so they don't do it.
Oh, I love it. So good. Yeah, but it comes back to how do we want to be known in this space? And when we can reflect on that, then we can say, okay, now what does this event say about me? And what response would be needed for me to reflect the identity that I want to have in relationship to other people or to my circumstances?
And man, we haven't even touched on the expressions of our identity in like the personal resilience realm. That's a whole different conversation we could have. I'm thinking about an alcoholic who thinks that their identity is an alcoholic, as opposed to that's an expression of who they believe themselves to be. There's a lot of association with the pen and controlling that. But sometimes that's an expression of who you believe yourself to be.
What we don't understand is that when we use identity-based language around, it's so easy to fall into the sphere of shame where we're shaming people. You're this, you're that, you're being this way. And and all nonviolent communication is really around like highlighting the facts of the matter. This is what we see. These are the facts. And just calling out identities doesn't necessarily change anybody. And there's so much identity work being done today. There's so much identity language flying around today. And, if someone is, and it's really hard to change an identity from the outside. That's a personal thing. But every identity that we have is rooted in a fact of who we are. Right? I'm a father because I have children. I'm a husband because I have a wife. I'm a podcaster because I'm on a podcast, right? All of those things.
Right.
So if you say, well, I'm an alcoholic, what's the fact underlying that identity? It's that I have a problem with alcohol. Facts we can work with. Facts we can improve upon. Facts we can use to build different identities. And so if there's a fact that we don't like, a fact about ourselves that we want to change, then we can actually take steps to change that. If I don't want to be known as an alcoholic, then I have to change the fact, not the identity. So I have to come down and do the work on adjusting my relationship to alcohol. And for a lot of people, that's just sobriety. And then that becomes a new identity for them. And I think for a good reason, that people use that as a reminder of how far they've come in their story and how much they've overcome. But I think that we have to get back to the underlying context of our identities, which are facts, are fact-based, and the facts of our life, the facts of our story, good, bad, beautiful, and ugly. It's all there. And we have the power and the ability to change the way we relate to those facts.
You can be guilty but healthy at the same time. If you're guilty in a court of law, it's just a reflection of what you're saying, facts. It's a reflection of truth, hopefully, in the justice system. Got it right. But you know what I mean? You've been proven guilty based on facts. And that seems like the starting point for development, growth, identity. And it's stuff.
Sounds like a part two.
I did want to say, yeah, I know it might be time for part two here. And maybe even touch on the story of the fish that you share with me.
I can share that real quick because I think it ties into what we've talked about organizationally and even personally. In his commencement address to Kenyon College, David Foster Wallace wrote, I think, an amazing piece called "This Is Water." And he begins this story with, two fish are swimming in the sea, and they come across an old fish who swims by and says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And the two fish swim on for a while until one turns to the other and says, "What the hell is water?" And it kind of articulates the sense that the context that we swim in can be so obvious that we never actually consider, that we never actually give any thought to the life around us. That life can just become so routine or just monotonous in a way that we fail to give any more attention to the obvious. And that, I think, is one of those, it comes back to that question of what am I missing? What am I not thinking about? And coming back to that, even at the organizational level, we control the pen for that too. If we get complacent by thinking that, you know what, I've got this workplace all figured out and I've been doing this, I've been at the same place for, 10, 15, 20, 30 plus years, there's nothing new here, then if we get to that place, then that should be an invitation to widen the aperture and ask more questions. Or at least at a minimum, ask us more questions about ourselves, about if the organization has stayed the same for that long, how have we changed over those periods of time? And reflect on that interpersonal level. And again, ask those questions. How do I want to be known? And what do I really want my life to look like? And are the circumstances that surround my life, or the facts of my life as they currently are they lining up for the life that I really want? And if not, we have the agency to make some changes.
That's a good story. I appreciate you sharing that, being able to capture, so much of what we talked about in such a short amount of time. If someone wants to reach out to you, connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, find me on LinkedIn. Shoot me a message, hit me up. That's where all my professional correspondence happens. So look me up, Steve Labue at LinkedIn.
There you go. I'll add in the notes. And any final thoughts as we wrap up for today?
Questions for people to just think about. Those questions of how do you want to be known, and who or what has control of your pen, and what are some situations in your workplace or in your home life where you can pursue excellence? What are some things that perhaps it's like, you know what, I could be intentional about making my relationship with my partner a little bit more excellent, or my relationship with my kids a little more excellent, or my relationship with my boss or my coworkers a little more excellent. And think on those things and then go do them.
That's right. And that's what we're, going to keep pushing for in terms of resilience, and keep fighting a good fight. Man, such a massive conversation to have. And, it doesn't end, with the ending of an episode on a podcast, that's for sure. Think about those questions, connect with Steve, and, look forward to more conversations in the future. And, till next time, EB out here.